Welcome. Nice to see a good turnout on a beautiful day. My name is James Carter. I'm the chair of the History Department, and it's my honor to welcome you to the annual Francis X. Gerrity Lecture. I want to take care of some happy obligations. First, do a couple of thanks to some really important people. First, this has really been a collaborative effort between the History Department and also the pre-law program. So I want to make sure that we thank the SJU Law Alumni Endowment, who their Law Alumni chapter, who support law and justice programming, and they attend and mentor to our students. So we're really happy to have also the chapter president who is here, Mary Cow Kelm. So I want to thank you for coming. I then want to thank three other people who are here. So the Francis X. Gerrity Lecture is named in honor of Francis Xavier Gerrity, who was a faculty member here and passed away in 2001. We're very happy to have two of his daughters here, and we'd like to please welcome them, Suzanne and Nancy. And then last, I'm doing this just because, oh, there she is. We'll be having another lecture in a couple of weeks, which is the David Burton Lecture, and I really want to recognize a great friend of the university and the department, Jerry Burton, who is here with us as well, so welcome. So the Francis Gerrity Lecture, as I say, is named in honor of one of the men who was really involved in creating what is the Department of History at St. Joseph's University. Of course, when he was here, the Department of History and Politics were one entity, but certainly David Burton and Frank Gerrity were instrumental in forming what I'm happy to call my professional home for the last 20 years. Frank wrote about they collaborated on a book on the history of St. Joseph's College, and both of them share in common a PhD from Georgetown University, which is a nice connection with the Jesuit roots of that institution and with this one. Really, the Gerrity Lecture has become a flagship of, I think, not just the History Department, but really of St. Joseph's University. Some of our recent lecturers have been Kathy Pice, who spoke recently from the University of Pennsylvania, Gary Bass from Princeton University, Eric Foner, who many of you may know his work on the Civil War, from Columbia, Mary Beth Norton from Cornell, who is currently the president of the American Historical Association, and Tom Segru, also of the University of Pennsylvania. I could go on and on, but we are really honored to add to that list Heather Ann Thompson today. And let me introduce her by saying two things that I embrace in my professional life quite a lot: history and St. Joseph's University. So about St. Joseph's, what I want to say is that it combines both a university as a place of scholarship and teaching, but also a mission to be men and women for others. And I think that's something to keep in mind as you hear today's talk. As a historian, and I can see some of my colleagues here in the audience, we often are conflicted about whether or not history is a social science or is a humanity. And I think there's really no better exemplar of how both of those things work together than in Heather Thompson. For a historian, to be a humanist means to look back into the past with empathy and tell the stories of human beings to better understand how it is that we came to be the human beings that we are today. And as social scientists, what we try to do is look at big questions and come up with answers using data, making arguments, and trying to help to make the world a better, and in this case, a more just place. And there is really no one better who does that and exemplifies that than Heather Ann Thompson, and there's no work of recent scholarship that better does that than Blood in the Water. Heather Ann Thompson, who received her Bachelor of Arts from University of Michigan, and also her MA from University of Michigan. She received her PhD from Princeton University. She worked at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and then down the road at Temple, before returning to Michigan, where she is currently professor of history. She has published widely, written on the history of mass incarceration, as well as its current impact for the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Salon, Dissent, New Labor Forum, and the Huffington Post. She served on a National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon panel that studied the causes and consequences of mass incarceration in the United States, and has given congressional briefings on the same subject. She's published peer-reviewed articles in the Journal of Urban History, the Journal of American History, Criminology and Public Policy, and the Journal of Law and Society, among others. She's an author of, most recently, Blood in the Water, the Attica Uprising of 1971 and its legacy, which is the winner of the Bancroft Prize in American History, winner of the Ridenauer Book Prize, winner of the Willard Hurst Book Prize in Socio-Legal History, Law and Literature Prize, on the long list for the Cundill Prize. Are you getting a trend here? Honorable mention, Silver Gavel Award from the American Bar Association, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, winner of the New York City Bar Association Book Prize, and is named on 14 best books lists of 2016, including Newsweek, the New York Times, Kirkus Reviews, the Boston Globe, and so on and so forth. By way of introduction, I'm going to read from her National Book Award finalist citation, which says, "Blood in the Water is a riveting history of the 1971 Attica prison uprising and massacre. After 10 years of extensive research, historian Heather Ann Thompson narrates the brutal event with compassion and analytical acuity. Thompson has a keen eye for both detail and the bigger picture, capturing the humanity of the prisoners and the callousness of state officials and conveying to readers why, nearly 5 decades after the killing, Attica still matters." Please welcome Heather Ann Thompson.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Thank you to the History Department, the Law Alum Association, to the Gerrity family. Thank you, really. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so excited to be here because even though I've left Philly for Detroit, which is where I'm from, I still feel like I'm from Philly. So I'm having like this really homesick moment. Even back, I was just in West Philly having lunch before I came over here today, and I was like, oh, I miss this place. So I'm so happy to be here. And we have a lot of different folks here. Do we have high school students here today, too? Which high school? Central. All right. I thought we had some Central folks in here, so that's great. I'm so happy you're here as well. And I am going to tell you about Attica, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way than maybe at least some folks are used to hearing about history, which is we start in the past and we may or may not get to the present. I'm actually going to start in the present and work backwards and try to persuade you why it is that I think that Attica matters today. I think it matters historically. I think it matters just because it's an important story. But I also think it actually matters in terms of policy today, in terms of what it tells us about where we are today. And I think that that's probably true of all history, but I want to make the case for you that I think it's particularly true about this event in a way that we did not appreciate. So when I talk about shining light on today, what do I mean by today? Well, today in this country, and again, this is not a news flash to some of you, but just bear with me, we have the world's not only largest penal apparatus, but it's the most racialized. It is historically unprecedented, which means we've never, ever had these numbers of people locked up. And it's also internationally unparalleled, which means that no other country on the planet anywhere has this many people locked up. And I just have some graphs. I promise you this whole story is not going to be about graphs, but let me start there just to show you what I'm talking about. The top graph compares us with myriad other countries, and certainly not all other countries, but here's the thing, it wouldn't matter who I had up here. Wouldn't matter, Russia, China, Rwanda, Norway, Sweden, it doesn't matter. We are a huge, huge international outlier. And when I said we were a racially disproportionate outlier, I can't stress that enough. The graph on your left shows you what this looks like in our country, but I invite you to look at the graph on the right, which compares our racial disproportionality compared to South Africa at the height of apartheid. Just to give you a sense of what it is that we as citizens have to explain, but also I think what history can help us to explain. The first thing I want to say is one of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons why we have to explain this. One of them is that despite what these numbers look like, they do not have any bearing on what's actually happening with regard to crime. For starters, if you look at the racial disproportionality, so much of it is down to the drug war, and yet we already know that the bulk of drug selling and the drug using is of white folks. So that can't explain it. And we also know that the absolute core of this is who gets criminalized, not for what are they criminalized. Look at this graph on the right. This is marijuana arrests, and I love to direct our attention here because certainly for young students, I don't think it's a news flash to tell you that young white folks like marijuana as much as anybody else, and if you look at that graph, you would not know that, right? It is so disproportionate who gets arrested and for what. Now, the other thing is, the system doesn't work. So we have to explain it not just because it's out of step with who's actually committing all the crimes, but it actually is barbaric, it's inhumane, and it doesn't work. And here's also the thing. We didn't have to do it this way. We think we did this, even if we don't like where we've ended up, we think we did this because crime was out of control in the 60s and 70s. And so we did this because we had to. And the thing about being a historian is that you get the real honor of going back and testing a lot of assumptions about the past. And the one thing that we've been able to establish pretty clearly is that we actually began this war on crime in 1965 under the Johnson administration, at a moment when you'll notice that the murder rate had not been that low since the 19-teens. And that tells you something about the war on crime. The war on crime in every moment in American history has been as much, if not more, a response to political change and political upheaval as it's been to actual crime. In fact, the crime rate in American history goes like this, up and down, and usually the prison rate stays pretty stable, but right after the 1970s, it goes through the roof. So I tell you all this because I want to suggest to you that what happens at Attica in 1971 matters to this story. And specifically that we got everything wrong about Attica. And because of that, it helps to explain this terribly, terribly punitive turn that we took. So let me just be a little clearer. This is the graph of incarceration over time. And again, remember what I just said? It goes on pretty steadily for most of American history, and then it takes this staggering leap up. Well, if I could zone in a little bit more clearly, you'd see that the staggering leap up actually does not happen right after we start this major war on crime in 1965. It takes a while. It actually does not go through the roof till about 1972, 1973. So actually what we have to explain with incarceration is not just a shift in policy with regard to crime fighting. We have to explain what happened in this country that makes people so punitive in their hearts. Why is it, for example, in my state of Michigan and your state, Pennsylvania, we have more children serving life sentences than any other state in this country? But every state in this country has children serving life sentences. When I say children, I literally mean people who have gone to prison 11, 12 years old. We've got to explain that because we're the only place that does that. It's weird, we never used to do that. We've got to explain it. So I want to suggest to you that Attica, and this book, Blood in the Water, is about Attica, helps us to shine at least a little bit of new light on this. This book, actually, James, the reading of, from the National Book Award says this book took 10 years. In fact, it took 13. I'm going to own those last 3 years. The reason why is because of the research process. And I'm not going to spend any time talking about this now, but later if you want to talk about it in Q&A, I'm happy to, because there could be a book on the research of this book. What's really fascinating is that the reason why we got Attica so wrong is because the entire story was covered up. Buried, shut down, and when I decided I wanted to do this book, I had no idea. I thought I'd be like every other historian. You go to the archive, you ask for box 20, folder 22, and you recreate the story. Well, no. The state of New York had completely shut down this story. So for 13 years, I battled with various parties trying to get this story. And I'm just sharing with you, the top left is a picture of the New York Times article explaining that all the records are going to be shut down on Attica. This is 1976. And then the rest of these headlines, there's me battling, usually the state troopers, trying to get the story told. And so it took a very long time. And the only way I was able to do this was to rely on the survivors, to rely on lawyers, and the incredible legal record that was left. But mostly, I was not able to tell you the real smoking gun, who shot whom piece of it that had been covered up for 45 years without a complete accident happening. I happened upon an incredible cache of records, which I can tell you about later. Okay, so what is this story? The story is a story that begins in upstate New York, just outside of a very, very tiny town called Attica. Anybody from upstate New York or know anything about this part of the country? All right, so this is, Attica's tiny, and if you're in it, it looks like a Norman Rockwell painting. It's got a bandstand, and it's, it's this slice of Americana. just outside of it looms this institution. It's still there, it's still in operation, it's still brutal. It's actually more brutal now than it was in '71. This was built during the Depression. It looks exactly today as it did the day it was built. It looked that way in '71, and when I was in there in 2004, it looked exactly the same. It has not been updated, it's not been modernized, and even in '71, it was already archaic. In this facility were about 2,400 young men, overwhelmingly black and brown men, from usually the boroughs of New York, various boroughs, and also the inner city of Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester. And these men were there. Many of them, you might be surprised who was there. A lot of young people, a lot of kids there on parole violations, a lot of folks there that had just come out of a youth facility awaiting resentencing. And yeah, there was also some folks that had committed quite a bit of public harm, but it was a real mixed bag. And the other side of the equation was a whole lot of young white guards. These are people who maybe just came back from Vietnam or were hoping to not go to Vietnam, and they are trying to get a job, and this is the best job in town. And you know, it's got a stable state pension, or at least so they hope. And here's what they all agreed on. This place was a nightmare. From the point of view of the prisoners, this is a place, and just think about this for a moment, they're being fed on 63 cents a day. They're being given 1 square of toilet paper a day. They can't see their children if they're not married to the mother of their children. If they get parole, they're handed this out-of-date phone book and told to write a letter to an employer, and if that employer agrees to hire them, then they can leave. Well, needless to say, not too many employers were eager to hire anybody. They were postmarked Attica, New York. And of course, even to write a letter required money. You needed stamps, you needed envelopes. Nobody had any money because people were also being forced to work in the metal shop, in all kinds of forced labor, getting paid 20 cents an hour and so forth. In addition, the medical care was just horrific. People had lost their teeth because there was no dental care. People were, if you had a pair of eyeglasses that you came in with, you better hope that nothing ever happened to them because you sure wouldn't get them again easily. And you had people dying of sepsis and very treatable injuries because the medical care was so bad there. So the one thing that everyone could agree on was that this place needed some serious change. Now, what is remarkable is that the guards said, look, we're going to lean on our union. This is a hellhole. We need a safer workplace. The prisoners were doing two things. On the one hand, this was a group of young men who were very much inspired by the civil rights movement, and they're learning, they're talking, they're sharing readings in the yard, they're getting educated about the importance of bringing the black freedom struggle inside of the prison. At the same time, though, there's this remarkable faith in the system. And they are writing letters to the Commissioner of Corrections, to various state senators, and they're basically begging, just fix this. Basic human rights issues, not major. On September 9th, though, 1971, everything explodes. And I just invite you for a moment to look at this picture and all the pictures I'm going to show you. As I show them to you, just be aware that these are pictures taken by law enforcement, which is going to be relevant to the story eventually. But this picture shows you just how chaotic the morning of September 9th was. The reason why there was this upheaval was down to a management decision. I won't bore you with the details now, but it wasn't planned. People get locked in this area, prisoners freak out, guards freak out, everyone's backing away from each other, they're arming themselves with whatever they can find. Mind you, no one has guns or anything. We're talking about, a baseball bat. And in this chaos, a gate comes open because it had a faulty weld. And pretty soon, the entire prison is involved in nothing short of a riot. And I use that word very carefully, because riot connotes chaos, danger, no clear plan, a lot of bloodshed, and that's what this looked like for a good solid half an hour. Prisoners are grabbing guards to protect themselves so they'd have a hostage. Some people are locking themselves back in cells to protect themselves. It's crazy because this thing happens during the breakfast hour. But what is amazing is that within a very short amount of time, cooler heads prevail. And these men, almost 1,300 of them, moved to one of the 4 exercise yards in Attica outside. And they do this for everyone's safety, and they do this because it dawns on them that they have this incredible opportunity to share what it's like to live in an American prison with all the outsiders. Because the thing is, prison then, just like today, is one of these places that we put all of our money, and yet nobody has a clue what goes on inside of them unless you have the unfortunate experience, and many of us do, of having a family member on the inside. So most Americans don't have a clue what's going on. This is what they wanted to show people, and they were very, very remarkably democratic. They elected people to represent them out of each of the cell blocks. They set up a medical tent, a food distribution tent. They had hostages, 40 of them, that they surrounded with 2 rings of prisoners to make sure they were protected. And very importantly, they brought in the media, because again, the thing about prisons is half the nightmare that goes on is because there's no transparency. They understood that, they invited the media in. And they asked for a bunch of observers to help them negotiate with the state. Now, for the older folks in the room, you'll recognize some of these people. That's Tom Wicker on the far right, columnist from the New York Times. In the middle is famed civil rights Marxist lawyer Bill Kunstler, and on the left is Clarence Jones, who edited a black newspaper in Harlem, the Amsterdam News. Why these guys? Because the people on the inside thought, these guys will give us a fair shake, they'll help us negotiate with the state. But they weren't the only ones. There was about 40 observers when all was said and done, because the state kept putting its own people on there. So there were Republican state senators and Democratic state senators. There was a Democratic congressman. There was a lot of folks on this. But what was their job? Make sure that negotiations would go on with the state and that everybody could surrender peacefully. Improvements would come to the prison, and something good would come of this. That was the plan. And indeed, for 4 long days and 4 long nights, that's exactly what happened. And it was historic. Imagine inside of this prison yard, you've got at the top picture on the left, the guy in the corner, that's Russell Oswald. He was the commissioner of the entire prison system in New York, and he's in there at the negotiating table with these prisoners. The prisoners are overwhelmingly African American and Puerto Rican, but not all. This was a multiracial human rights struggle. Again, one of the most remarkable in American history. And these negotiations go on really successfully for 4 long days and 4 long nights. And I mean, it's through the cup. What do they want? Again, better medical care, Spanish-speaking guards. So, for example, that the Puerto Rican prisoners could understand what the directions were, and so forth. Meanwhile, while this is going on, this is also going on. For the same period, the same 4 long days and nights, you had every state trooper battalion from upstate New York descending upon Attica, and corrections officers from every upstate prison. Now, I want to be clear here that the story I'm going to tell you may sound like I'm going to be throwing law enforcement under the bus a bit, but let's be clear. These men have also been told a whole lot of false stories. These men are arriving at Attica. They are being told that the prisoners inside are committing unimaginable atrocities, etc. Why? Because I found out that the FBI is on the scene, planting lies, planting rumors, and not only that, sending teletypes, kind of updates as to what's going on, all the way up to the president, the vice president, the Attorney General, the CIA, the FBI, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. And this is a tiny little town in upstate New York. So what it kind of hints to you is how important people in charge thought this was, how alarmed they were by this kind of grassroots uprising. Because the observers could see this on the outside, they start to get really worried, because even though these negotiations are going on really smoothly, there's one sticking point, and that is amnesty. Because the prisoners know they cannot surrender until they are given the assurance that they will not be physically harmed and that they will not be indiscriminately prosecuted. In other words, that they will get another 50 years for having dared to rebel, and they are terrified of being beaten up by the people that are going to come in and retake the prison. So amnesty is key. The one guy who can make this happen is the governor. And he's very famous. His name is Nelson Rockefeller. And Rockefeller was known as the liberal Republican, good guy governor of New York. But what people didn't quite fully understand was who Rockefeller was. Rockefeller was a liberal Republican at a time when the Republican Party was getting more and more conservative, particularly on the issue of law and order. And he was really irritated that Richard Nixon had become the president, not him, and he was determined to show his own party that he could be as tough on crime as anyone else, and that certainly meant not negotiating with prisoners. So he was intransigent. He would not agree to amnesty, so they said, so come to the prison. Just stand out in front of the prison. You don't even have to meet any of the prisoners. Just stand out there and endorse the demands, assure people that they can surrender and they won't be harmed. We've got to end this peacefully. You've got 40 state employees in there hostage. We have 1,300 men in there. We have to end this peacefully. He says, nope, not gonna do it. So the observers send a telegram basically to the entire New York state and say, basically call your governor, tell him to settle this. And notice that they don't mince any words. They make it clear that if he doesn't settle this thing peacefully, this is what's gonna happen. And he is as clear as you could be on what the consequences are gonna be. And yet, nobody is listening. Now, I now know, because of these smoking gun documents I found, that in fact he had no intention of solving this peacefully. He had every intention of going in forcibly. And what you're seeing here is those troopers, and this was going on for 4 days, passing out weapons indiscriminately. You're talking about deer hunting rifles. You're talking about shotguns that have a spray, an indiscriminate spray of 6 feet of pellets. You're talking about rifles that some of them had never been trained to shoot. You're talking about ammunition outlawed by the Geneva Convention, and you're talking about people bringing their personal weapons from their lockbox in their house or from under their pillow. And remember, I told you these guys are mad. They are being fueled and stoked up. And on the 5th morning, when the guys inside think that negotiations are still going on, it's a cold September morning in upstate New York, rain is falling, there's no way this thing is gonna go on much longer anyway. They think negotiations are still going on. Sure, the state officers had come to the gate and said, no, you gotta let go of the hostages, we're done. But they'd said that every morning. And I now know that they deliberately didn't give them an ultimatum. They deliberately did not tell them what the consequences of this were gonna be. So on that 5th morning, as these guys are waking up, it's 8:30 in the morning, they hear the sound of a helicopter revving up. And to show you how kind of the remarkable kind of faith in other human beings they had, some of them think Rockefeller's coming. And they're so relieved, like tears come to, people are just so relieved. But then the savvier of them start thinking about it, and they hadn't seen the observers, and they start to get really worried because this doesn't seem right. And then they start to realize this is not good. It looks like there's gonna be an assault. Now, still they don't think guns, because no prison has ever been retaken that way. People come in with nightsticks, right? Or you send in the National Guard, who has had some training in riot control. They have no clue what's about ready to happen. So they still have faith, and that leads them to this ill-fated decision. They decide, the prisoners, that they're gonna take some of the hostages up on these catwalks that overlook the prison yard. And here's the plan. And by the way, they discussed this, they talked about it openly, and the guards who were held hostage and the civilian employees, they had also known that this was the plan, although they were very nervous that it would backfire. But the plan was that they would surround each of these guards with 3 or 4 prisoners with these makeshift weapons, right? Like a shaved off stick or a baseball bat or a hand-fashioned spear. And they would surround the guards so that when the helicopter, should it come back over, they would, see, look, you don't want to come in here, right? Because if you come in here, you're jeopardizing your own men, right? And this is their last-ditched hope that the state officers are going to care enough about their own employees to continue negotiating. And in the book, I take you up on this catwalk, and you get to meet, for example, a young guard, Mike Smith, 24 years old, and he's standing next to a prisoner, Don Noble. They had worked together in the metal shop at Attica. And Mike was one of those guards that the prisoners liked because he said, you know, absolutely, you should have better conditions. And he'd actually seen the letter they'd written to the commissioner. He's like, seems makes sense to me. And they're up here, and they are terrified. They're sick with fear. Their knees are shaking, their hands are shaking, and they are exchanging pleasantries to make each other feel better, but they're also exchanging personal information. Mike says to Don, look, if I don't get out of here, I have a note in my back pocket. My wife's name is Sharon. Can you please make sure she gets it and tell her that I love her? And Don exchanges the same, you know, where his family is. And right at this moment, and everybody is up there, I mean, they are literally ready to vomit. They are so scared. And a second helicopter starts to come over the prison, much bigger than the first. And the way Mike describes it is that the concussion was so loud, you could feel it in your chest. And right at that moment that this helicopter comes over, it starts dropping these canisters of CN and CS gas over the yard. Now, that's tear gas. And I don't know about some of you, but like when I would look at the protest movies and tear gas going, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's a bummer, but you know, it's tear gas. Tear gas is actually a powder. And this powder that was exploding all over the yard gets in your mucous membranes, in your eyes, down your throat, and it basically, if you look at the film, it mows everybody down, and they are vomiting, and they can't see, and they're retching, and right when everybody is incapacitated, they send in almost 300 heavily armed state troopers who just start shooting. That's how thick the gas was. Notice that they have gas masks on, and for 15 minutes, all you can hear on the film is the sound of someone on a megaphone on the helicopter saying, surrender with your hands up and you won't be harmed, surrender with your hands up and you won't be harmed, to the sound of da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And needless to say, within 15 minutes, it was carnage. In fact, it's actually kind of remarkable how low the death toll was, but it was like a battle scene. Doctors that finally managed to get in later would say it looked like a Civil War battle scene. People were permanently traumatized just from seeing what this yard looked like. 39 men, prisoners and hostages alike, dead. And a total of 128 men had been shot so severely, some of them 6, 7 bullet wounds. And I'll get back to this in a moment. But let's just take a commercial break here to say that at this moment, this is what's just happened. And remember, it's on the news, so every American is watching this, right? And they're being told by the state officials that something completely different happened. The prisoners killed the hostages, they said. And not only that, one of the hostages had been castrated. Can you imagine? And his testicles had been shoved in his mouth by these barbarians. And the guard they were talking about was Mike Smith, the one I was just telling you about. Mike Smith hadn't been castrated. Mike Smith had been shot in precision 4 times across his abdomen by a fellow corrections officer who likely did not like his cozy relationship with the prisoners. But that's not what everyone heard in America. And the state, not only did they say this has happened, they said, we've seen it with our own eyes. We can corroborate it. We have film of it. And that story went out on the front page of the New York Times. Notice this quotation. It reflects a barbarism wholly alien to civilized society. Prisoners slash the throats of helpless, unarmed guards. And that story went out on the front page of the LA Times. And most importantly, that story went out on the front page of went out over the AP News Service, which meant that it was on the small town front pages of every newspaper in the country. Now, just pause, because right before Attica, polling data show very clearly that most Americans, the majority of Americans, had turned away from the death penalty. They thought it was immoral. They had voted that prisoners should have basic human rights, and not only that, that we should stop this big warehousing of prisoners and we should start moving more towards community corrections. That's what the data said. Within a year of this, everybody's calling for the death penalty again. This punitive ethos had happened. But here's the tragedy. Again, that's not the story. Not only was the story that these people had been shot and killed by law enforcement who were utterly unarmed, but that was just the beginning of the trauma. And forgive me ahead of time for this slide, I won't even read it. But let me assure you that what happens during the retaking is but the tip of the iceberg. For days and weeks and months, these men are tortured. You can see in the bottom left slide, they are lined up, they are stripped. They are forced to run a gauntlet. They are forced to crawl and run across broken glass. Remember that every window has been shot out of Attica. There's glass everywhere. They were being forced to run a gauntlet, some of them with 6 and 7 bullet wounds. They couldn't even stand up. The guy on the table in the upper right, the black guy with the football under his neck, his name was Big Black. And he was the one that they said had castrated Mike Smith. And for hours and hours, this man is tortured. And notice, he's not the only one. And notice that we have a picture of it, because people were watching it. It's like lynching photography, commemorating it. State senators are watching it. People are watching this go on, but nobody cares because they think that this prisoner is an animal and he doesn't deserve anything less than what he's getting. The trouble was, not only is that barbaric in itself to think that way, but he hadn't done anything. And Rockefeller calls Nixon that day because he's a little worried. I mean, this didn't exactly quite go to plan. You have a whole lot of dead hostages. And Nixon has basically one question for him, which is this a black business? And Rockefeller says, why, yes, Mr. President, it is. Well, first of all, it wasn't. Just simply look at the picture. This is a multiracial human rights uprising. But more to the point, that's all he needed to know. He could care less if this was, as he put it, a black business. This bottom picture of Big Black is after he's been tortured for about 6 hours. Both of his wrists are broken. He's been burned, he's been beaten, and he's on a stretcher. And this picture is taken before he's about ready to run yet another gauntlet up in segregated housing. American people don't hear anything about this. In fact, any time that people are trying to tell what's happening, they're told they're liars because they're just criminals, they're thugs, don't believe them. And meanwhile, the guard families are also getting screwed. Remember that they've also lost people to gun violence, right? They've also been shot. They come out of prison and they are traumatized. These are families oftentimes where the husband is the guard, he's the main breadwinner in this upstate New York town. The wives, a lot of Catholic families who basically the mother had stayed home, large families, and they're basically told, guess what, we're gonna take care of you. In fact, while this torture is going on inside the prison, state officials are showing up at these widows' houses. Here, Mrs. Cunningham, here's a little check to tide you over. You know, groceries. Meager check, $140. Mrs. Cunningham has 8 kids, so she's grateful for the help. But they don't tell Mrs. Cunningham that by cashing that check, she is electing a remedy under New York state law, which basically means she is statutorily prevented from ever suing the state of New York for the death of her husband. And they did this on purpose, I was able to find out. Meanwhile, of course, they're also being lied to about what's happened to their husbands or brothers or sons. The state troopers are going to the funeral homes and intimidating the funeral directors and demanding that they sign affidavits saying that these people have been slit, their throats have been slit by prisoners, when in fact they've been shot. And in fact, Mrs. Cunningham herself goes to the funeral home to see her husband's body. And this is all a small town. She knows Mr. Marley. Mr. Marley's a funeral director. Everybody knows everybody else. And he brings her into the back room, and he says, and he lifts up the sheet so she can see that her husband has been shot. And he looks at her terrified and goes like this. Because he doesn't want the troopers to know that he's just told her what's happened to her husband. Now, the good news is there was a coroner, a guy, brave guy, who ends up telling the truth about what had happened, that fact that everyone had been shot to death. But you know what? By this time, the story's out, the damage is done. If you go to upstate New York right now and you go to one of these small towns and you say who killed the hostages at Attica, they're going to tell you the prisoners. Notwithstanding the heroic efforts of this coroner, the telegrams that were flowing into this prison were basically calling for more blood, calling for longer sentences, calling for no human rights in prisons. Now, I'm about ready to end this talk so we can open it up, but let me just tell you how this all goes, because this is important. There are some investigations. You can't have this much bloodshed without the body public wanting to know what happened. And the first one was a citizens commission, and it did a pretty good job of getting to the bottom of some of this, but the truth was it couldn't fully get to the bottom of it because, hell, 13 years it took me. And I'm still not persuaded I'm at the bottom of it. They couldn't tell a story of documents that they weren't given access to. So that was itself limited. There was a congressional investigation, pretty ineffectual, doesn't really do anything. There's an FBI investigation. Remember that horrible quote I showed you that I wouldn't read? That came from a doctor on the scene, and he took that story to the FBI's Justice Department. And they said, nothing here, no civil rights case here. And in fact, what happens is that the bulk of the investigation into what had happened at Attica gets down to the New York investigation that was called for by none other than Nelson Rockefeller. And he appoints a special attorney general, and he puts it in the organized crime task force unit because he wants to show there's been a conspiracy of radicals that led to this, because it's not legit, right? And he puts the same New York State Police who had retaken the prison in charge of investigating it. So, needless to say, there's no chalk markings made of any bodies. Any evidence that might have implicated a member of law enforcement quickly disappears. Statements get doctored, film gets spliced, photographs get lost. And the entire investigation starts focusing on the prisoners. And indeed, not one member of law enforcement ever gets held responsible for what happens at Attica, despite all the death and the shooting. But 62 surviving prisoners get indicted under 42 separate felony indictments. And this matters because remember I told you there's these lies told in 1971? And everybody says, my God, I thought the civil rights movement was like cool and right on, but man, prisoners, they're animals. They're rapists, murderers, thugs, and thieves, and they need to throw away the key. And then for the next 5 years, they watch nothing but black and brown prisoners being paraded in front of the nightly news every night, reinforcing, of course, that Attica's all about what the prisoners did wrong. Not one member of law enforcement is ever held accountable. And how do I know that? Because that has to do with the smoking gun document I found. The thing that killed me was no matter how many people I talked to, and no matter how much of a good researcher I thought I was, I couldn't figure out the main question I had, which is, how do you have this many people get killed, and this many people get shot, and this many people get tortured, and nobody is held accountable? And I found the smoking gun documents that told me not only what evidence the state had against members of law enforcement, but what their names were, what they had done, and I tell you that in the book. After 45 years, those people were protected, and it's in the book, which we can talk about that. I don't end the book there. The book ultimately ends, believe it or not, on a much more optimistic note. This is Big Black, and he and his fellow formerly incarcerated people spend the next 30 years trying to take their case to court, and they do so through the civil court process in an extraordinary civil court story. I forgot to tell you, during the criminal trials before that, one of the most extraordinary legal defense efforts in American history. Young lawyers and law students descend on upstate New York to protect these guys and to make sure that they're not going to get railroaded. And remarkably, only 5 cases go to trial, and these guys, the prisoners win every one of them but one, and ultimately, even that, they get clemency for. This is an incredible legal defense story. I tell you the whole thing, right up there with the Scottsboro Boys. Right now, this is actually being used in a lot of law schools, and you can see why, because it's a reminder of the importance of the human part of legal defense and lawyering. The civil case that comes out of this is equally remarkable, and the guards also have their day where they get a settlement from the state of New York. None of them feel like they had justice. They will tell you that it wasn't justice, it wasn't even close to justice, but it was the closest thing to justice that they were ever going to get. But I do leave you with some hope, believe it or not, because even though this entire story, because it isn't just Attica, it's Kent State, Orangeburg, Chicago 68, I mean, every moment of this period between sort of 1965 and 1975, Wounded Knee, all of these stories are episodes of grassroots attempts to democratize our country and make it more just. And in every single one of them, the violence that explodes there is down to the state. And somehow, though, we come away with that as a country saying, we want more police. We want fewer civil rights. We want fewer rights for people. It's completely counterintuitive. And one of the reasons we do that is because we don't get this history told. We are not able to hear from the people that really knew what happened, and one of the reasons we discredited them, if you call someone a criminal, you discredit them. And so, on the one hand, it's that negative of a story. On the other hand, though, on the day this book came out, in 2016, and by the way, it was embargoed, which meant that nobody could lay eyes on this book until the day it came out, which is very unusual. For those of you who don't know about publishing, like your editor hates that because they want to get some pre-publicity, they'd like to get some book reviews before it comes out, and I was like, no. Because I was terrified that someone would try to shut it down before it was actually out. I was terrified that, namely that the people who were named in there would try to shut it down. They humored me, so it was embargoed. So nobody saw it. But on the day that this came out, 40,000 prisoners from all over this country engaged in a major work stoppage, protest, because it was the anniversary of the Attica Uprising, and that meant something to them. And conditions since 1971 have gotten worse. We do more solitary confinement than we ever did in 1971. We have more barbaric prisons than we had in 1971 because we failed to get the lesson right about what Attica was about. But the prisoners inside did not fail to become human beings. They did not cease to become human beings. And so the thing about Attica is that its one legacy is repression, but the other legacy is humanity, that no matter how much you lock somebody up, no matter what they ended up in there for, they are nevertheless human beings, and they have basic human rights at the very least, and Attica reminds us of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've never been so inspired by what historians can accomplish. Question from the audience, and following tradition here at St. Joseph's, we'd like the first question to be from students, please. So my colleagues, please sit on your hands until we hear from you.
And I'm happy to, anything's game. You want to talk about the research or Attica itself or the writing or whatever. So happy to talk about whatever. Yes. To tell you the story about finding the documents? Okay, let's hold that 1 minute. Let's get a few questions and I'll definitely answer that. Yes. Okay, so the two questions were one about the research, how did I find those documents, and the other was, had that gate come open, not come open, would there have still been Attica? So I don't love thinking about counterfactuals, but I will tell you that yes, it would have happened. Because the thing is, you can't hold other human beings in cages and treat them as less than human indefinitely and not expect eventually for them to stand up. So the fact that this moment happens when it happens was definitely circumstantial, but even since Attica, there have been so many episodes just like it. One of them most recently was very close to all of you all in Delaware, right when the book came out, right? There was at Vaughan prison, there was taking hostages, same kind of deal. And so again, we just have to remember that. To me, what's an interesting corollary to your question is, could they have avoided it? Yes. I mean, one of the startling things about Attica is that if you look internationally at the way other people handle criminal justice, it's not like this is rocket science. It's not like we cannot imagine a way to deal with wrongdoing in our society, right? And I always think about, this is like, it sounds so simplistic, but I always kind of bring it back home. It's like if you think about your own family and you think, well, if I had someone in my family, even if they'd done something terrible, like what would you want to happen to them? And it seems pretty clear, right? You wouldn't want them to be tortured. You'd want them to know, we have a plan, but somehow we lose the plan, particularly if we other the people for whom this is happening. So the research story, that's actually a more humorous story, which maybe we could use a little dose of levity at this moment. I had been calling every upstate New York courthouse looking for records because I couldn't, what happened? I knew there were criminal trials, so there had to have been some evidence somewhere that I could look at that the state of New York was not barring me from looking at. And nobody has Attica records, nobody has them. And I thought, criminal trial records, surely someone has that, but I didn't know the litigant's name, I didn't know the case numbers. I mean, I was flying blind. And then one day I get this call from this lady in Erie County, which is Buffalo, that's where a lot of these trials were. And she says, I think we've got some Attica records here. And I said, oh, and mind you, at the time, I was a professor in North Carolina. I think I was making like $36,000 a year. I had 3 kids at home, and I'm like, let me get on a plane. Because I was so shocked that there might be some records. And I immediately dropped it. I went up to Buffalo. And she leads me into this courthouse, and I just have to describe this because in a courthouse, it's very orderly, and all the records are very orderly. But in this case, she takes me into a back room. It is dark. It is dingy. There's no table. There's no chairs. And on a wall, probably as big as that screen, is a blizzard of Attica papers. I mean, I start taking them off. It is grand jury testimony and autopsy reports. I mean, it's the mother lode of documents. And then I start looking around, like, are there cameras? What's going on here? Because I am freaking out, and especially because I find 2 documents that were critical. And one of them came from inside of the Rockefeller administration. It was called Confidential Memo at Attica. And it showed that there had been a series of secret meetings at Rockefeller's pool house, you can't make this stuff up, in his estate, where he is essentially meeting with the state troopers and the attorney general, and they're all getting their story straight. And I found that document. The other thing I found was a whistleblowing document from inside of the Attica investigation, 167 pages. There was only 3 copies ever written. This was one of them. And it named the shooters, what they had done, what the evidence was that the state had. I couldn't believe it. So I had to figure out, how am I going to get this stuff out of here? And I won't lie, there is a moment when I'm contemplating, stuffing them down my pants or something, and then I decide I don't want to go to Attica, so that's probably not a good idea. But seriously, and my students say to me, why didn't you scan them? Okay, it's 2006. There were no smartphones. I had this little flip Nokia, no, we're not going to scan them. So I had to figure out how I'm going to get them out of here. So finally I said, okay, maybe I can copy them. And this is not an obvious thing because these are not regular documents. This is not like a case you can ask them to, what do you do with these? They don't know. I don't know. So can I please can I please copy them? And the woman says, well, I don't know. I mean, this is kind of irregular. You know, I guess maybe you should go meet with the clerk of court. And the clerk of court was this lovely man, politician, you know, completely coiffed, you know, looks like a politician. I still feel very guilty about him, just so you know. Because I said to him, well, so I might have said I was a history teacher, not professor. I might have said I was writing a paper, not a book. I'm not really sure what I said, but I made it seem like, you know, it's no big deal. You do have some Attica papers, and would it be okay if I maybe made some copies? And he said, well, you know, I think that sounds like that's reasonable. And then I realized it's going to be $1.50 a page. And did I mention I was making like $36,000 a year as a professor? So I'm like, oh God, that's not going to happen. And I'm almost in tears at this point because I don't even know how I'm going to get this stuff out of here. So I finally said, well, I'm just a history teacher working on this paper. Can you please, like, is there something we can do? And he said, well, what do you think would be fair? And I said, well, what if I gave you a check? Because back then we wrote checks. What if I gave you a check for $200 for as much as I could Xerox? And he says, you know, I think that's reasonable. This is why I feel really guilty. And so I said, oh, thank God. And then he says, so make sure that you hand your stack to, I don't remember her name, Marge or something. I'm like, oh no. Because of course, anybody can see what I'm trying to Xerox. It says in the special grand jury of the state of New York. So I go in this back room and I start burying what I want amidst all this paperwork that I could care less about. And I walk it out to her, and it's one of these Xerox machines, you know, that goes like this. I couldn't believe it. Like, this is the worst luck of all. And so she takes the stack, and she starts slowly copying it. And so I only have one choice. I just start talking like a maniac. I'm like, oh my God, is that picture of your granddaughter? She's so cute, blue eyes. Does she favor your husband? That shirt you have, did you get that at Target? I wonder if they have that in my size. She is looking at me like I'm a lunatic. She is, you know, Xeroxing as fast as she can to get me out of here. So I managed to get the documents out. Fast forward, the book is about ready to come out. A reporter calls me and says, so I hear you've got these great documents from the Erie County Courthouse. I'm like, oh, because I had kept this under wraps for years. And I thought, oh my God, this guy, I've worked on this for 13 years, and he's gonna put this in the newspaper, he's gonna scoop the whole story, and he's gonna get it wrong. And then I more charitably thought, and they're gonna disappear those documents. Sure enough, he calls me a week later, he says, they say they have no Attica documents and they've never had them. I said, let me guess. You called and said you wanted this document. He says, yeah. I said, are you kidding me? You know, of course they're going to say they have no documents. They called him a week later. They says, actually, we do have one box. And they handed him one box. And in that box were the indictments of the prisoners. Now, you have to understand the significance of this. That means that they had to go through every piece of paper in what I just told you was a blizzard of papers, pick out the ones that would be acceptable, the ones that made, again, Attica look like it's all about the prisoners, and God knows where everything else is. They're gone. And so that's that story. Yes? Yep. So the question is about the media. Was it all negative? Was it all showing the repression or showing the negativity of the prisoners, or was it also showing a human side of them? So the answer is absolutely there was both. And in fact, I often do this talk for journalist students when I talk specifically about the media. And here's what's really important to know. The media played a very powerful positive role in this. First, initially in the prison, getting this story out. And then even the mainstream reporters that reported the story of the throat slashing, the minute they realize that they've been duped, they try to change the story. And interestingly, some of their editors are the ones that don't really want to do it. But meanwhile, there's an alternative press, there's a left press, there's a black press that never told the lie, that never would have told the lie. That's very vibrant. And in fact, even in the mainstream press, there was a journalist by the name of John Johnson, who, if you've ever seen the Eyes on the Prize, he's the one outside of Attica reporting. And he called me after my book was out, and he said he was an ABC reporter, and he refused to print the /U story, and he got fired. So this is a mixed bag, and the important thing is, even though in my talk today I have stressed the mainstream American response to Attica, what you need to know, sounds like you do know, there's also an incredible amount of support for the Attica brothers, and that's in large part because of this alternative media that's making sure that their story is getting out. So both are happening at the same time. The problem is, of course, that the mainstream media, and let me not ever say that again, mainstream media, because now it's been tainted. The more traditional media is telling a completely different story. But yes, there's a vibrant, real coverage of this. So thank you for that. Yes? Were there any politicians or guards who were willing to? Yes. So the question is, so were there good politicians and guards and troopers? Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you need to know is that one of the prisoners, even their ability to finally have a civil suit with the state of New York depended on the fact that, look, I mean, even troopers were so traumatized by what they had seen, what went down, that they for 30 years held this inside and then came and testified on behalf of the prisoners. Politicians stuck in there for prison reform. So one of the reasons why this is such a powerful story is it's a very human story. It's not easy who the good guys and the bad guys are, and there's multiple good guys and bad guys no matter what hat they wear. You know, one of the things that happens before the troopers go into Attica is they rip off their identifying badges, like literally before they go in, which you can imagine, right, what that signals. The only reason we know that is because some of their fellow troopers were so horrified they testified to it in court 30 years later. There's also doctors on the scene who are traumatized by this and who later tell their stories. So politicians, guards, doctors, troopers, all these people who were not the prisoners themselves were marked and scarred by this, some of them for the rest of their lives, and they did the right thing. And for the prisoners, you know, it's a real incredible story of tenacity. They don't fully get to tell their story on the record until 2000, and they show up. Some of them are crippled, some of them are sick, but they take a bus and they go to Rochester and they tell their story. So there's a hugely human, positive part of this story too. Yes? Okay, so the question is, why are, if incarceration rates spike in the 70s, why are they still so high today? Well, there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. I mean, eventually we become invested in the system at every level, from, you know, all the services provided to it, the tampons, the tasers, the telephones, there's profit connected to it. There's, you know, entire industries built around it. It employs an incredible number of people. But to me, all of that is symptom, not cause. And I think that the only way we really understand the cause is to understand the ethos behind it. So the real question is, what is it that can make so many Americans look at other people's shortcomings and other people's mistakes and other people's worst day and respond so punitively to them when they would not respond to the exact same stimuli with their own children? That's about racism. That's about the worst features of our country. And the thing about Attica and places like Attica was it just fueled that. It just fanned the flame. Because imagine if the narrative coming out of Attica would have been what really happened. that people are tortured who didn't do anything, that the people who had been shooting had been members of law enforcement. The guards later said, the real animals, this was a quote, the real animals were outside of that prison. Now, would that have turned it around? Not necessarily, but it sure did not help that we fueled the worst elements in our nation's society, and I think we still do. You can't turn on the news and not be repeatedly indoctrinated with this idea, which is why I began with this slide, that the people who do the crime do the time. When we know that that's not true, when we know that what decides whether you end up behind bars has much more to do with your race and class and your socioeconomic standing than it has anything to do with the act that you commit, including murder, right? So why? I think that's that cultural thing we have to explain. But thank you for the question. Did you have a, no? Okay, yes. Central in the house today. Okay. That's a great question. So her question was, had the prison been more white, not mostly African American or Puerto Rican, would it have gone down quite this way? Would it have been covered up? That's a hard one, because I do think that we have so written off people in prison as not human that even white people, once they end up behind prison, end up getting dehumanized. And certainly at Attica, to be white in Attica didn't save you very much, because once those troopers came in, anyone who was white who had stood up with anyone who was not white gets, all the racial epithets came their way too. But you can't understand the brutality without understanding that this was really about racism. I mean, these men are being forced to do the white power salute. Troopers are urinating in open wounds. People are being kicked off of stretchers as doctors are trying to help them. I mean, and this is all punctuated with racial epithets. So let me put it to you a different way. Had it been a country club prison of embezzling, domestic abuser, white guys, would that have happened? No. Probably not. Yes. So the question is, Attica being worse today than in 1971. I mean, this is one of the really tricky things. I mean, some people would disagree with me on that, particularly people who work in the New York State prison system have said to me that that's not really true because, for example, visiting rules are better now than they were then. I mean, there's no question that Attica had some positive impact. New York became a more liberal prison system in some ways than other places, and that's true. But the sheer fact remains that prisons are more overcrowded now than they were in 71. People are doing much more solitary confinement. People have much longer sentences, and the transparency problem has gotten even worse. Like, you just don't know what's going on. So the deaths in custody in prison in this country is catastrophic. People dying in prison, but nobody knowing why or what happened. And at Attica in particular, the reason why I say it's worse is because Attica is like a trauma site. Every single day this event plays itself. It's like Groundhog Day, over and over and over again. The guards there are the children of former guards, and they're there to teach prisoners a lesson on a daily basis. And the prisoners are still coming from New York and Buffalo and not from Attica, and they're still being othered, and now they are a younger generation of prisoners who frankly are not as educated. They're not reading Malcolm X, they're not learning about the civil rights movement, so they're angrier. I mean, this is a really tense place. And recently, in 2011, there was a horrific beating of an Attica prisoner, George Williams. And the only reason we know about it, and this should again scare you, it should scare you that it takes me a sheer accident to be able to tell you what happens in one of the most important events in American history. And we only know about what happened to George Williams because he's beaten so severely by the guards in C Block. They kick him down flights of stairs, they break every bone in his body, he's next to death, but they take him to the prison infirmary. And there's a young woman there, a nurse. She'd only been there 10 months, she's new. And There'd been plenty of beatings. This happens regularly, but she took one look at him and she knew that he was going to die. And she had ethics. She had morals. And she said, this man needs to go to the hospital. And they pushed back, no, he didn't. And she insisted that this man go to the hospital. And that's the only reason we know what happened to George Williams, because she stood up and did the right thing. So when I say it's worse, in some respects it's worse because now you got the transparency and we as a society don't care. In 1971, there was a lot of prisoner rights activists out there who cared, who were banging on the door, who wanted us to make it better. I think we're getting back there, but we've been 40 years without that. Any other last questions? Yes. Yeah, so 39 were killed, both prisoners and hostages. 128 prisoners in total were shot. And what happened to them was they were all stripped down. They were thrown in these strip cells with nothing in them, just concrete. They were denied medical attention for weeks. Doctors were banging on the door to try to get in to help them. You know, even when they retake the prison, the superintendent has not had any provision for medical care. And when they finally bring some doctors in, they kick them all out at midnight. So people are wounded, bleeding, and then they're tortured. They're just tortured for days and weeks. And eventually, a lot of them are transferred to other prisons. But either way, they don't get out. I mean, they relive this day in and day out because the same guards that retook the prison are the guards that are in the prison now. And so but again, this is the good part about it. Meanwhile, you've got reporters banging on the door, you got lawyers banging on the door, you got people saying, we're not gonna let this stand. And that's why we know about it. And after Vaughn, recently in Delaware, when there was a similar thing, I was on the news. I was actually in an event in Toronto when this prison blew up. This is in 2017, is that right, or 16? I can't remember, 16 maybe. And there's a standoff. It looks like Attica. There's prisoners. They've taken hostages. There's an aerial, helicopter overhead. And I was supposed to be on the morning news. I was on Fox News that morning, local Fox. And right when I go on the news, it's pretty clear something's happened because all of a sudden prisoners are being paraded out, face down on the concrete, men standing over them with guns. And the reporter says, well, what do you think's happening, Dr. Thompson? And I said, well, I think that they've just retaken the prison. And I just felt sick. Because at that moment, I knew that was when everyone else was gonna go home. Nobody was gonna find out what was going on. But that inside, that's when the real hell started. Because once there has been an uprising, the retaliation is severe. And I called the ACLU, I called everybody when I got off the phone, like, is anyone showing up at Vaughn? Is anyone showing up to see what's going on? And what ultimately happened there was 2 guards that died. There was only 3 at the end. They'd let a lot of hostages go, and 2 of them died. No, 1 of them died. And this is what the media said. The riot is now over. A female hostage has been taken to the hospital, and a male guard has died. Now, I just want to stop there for a minute and think about that, right? So if you say a female guard went to the hospital, I mean, kind of panic, right? What happened? Oh my God, like what did they do to her, right? This is the immediate rape, attack, what happened to her? Now, I don't know what happened to her or not, but I know that that's what that invokes. Is it also possible that she's just lived through a riot and she went to the hospital to be checked on? Could she also be fine? She could be, we don't know. We just know that a female guard has been taken to the hospital. And a male guard dies. Do we know why he's died? No. Has he had a heart attack? Has he been shot? Has he been stabbed? Has he been strangled? Has he been shot by one of the guards that came in or one of the police that came in to retake the prison? We have no idea. I think it's very notable that we never heard, so that makes me think that if she had been raped or a prisoner had killed him, we'd probably hear about it, but whatever. The point is we don't know. And that's the whole point. That's the point about transparency. Like, and that's today. All we hear is someone went to the hospital, someone died, and our minds run rampant. Prisoners are animals. They need to be locked up. They're not human beings. And then we're right back at square one. And I hope that Attica is one of those cautionary tales that kind of makes us skeptical and makes us want to know the full story. Thank you so much. Oh, we got one more here? Okay. Yes, last question. So he asked about the movie adaptations of Attica. Well, this is a little fraught of a subject for me because this is going to be made into a movie. So it's a little fraught for me because I'm terrified about what's going to happen. So the previous movies of Attica, there's three really good documentaries: The Ghost of Attica, Criminal Injustice at Attica, and The Eyes on the Prize version of Attica. The documentaries I largely like. The screen adaptations of the story, in my opinion, have been horrendous, with the exception of one which was on the criminal trials. It was starred Alan Alda, and it was called The Killing Yard, and it was really good. It's about one of the most important defense efforts. It's a great movie. Very hard to find, but a great movie. So I don't know. This is going to be made by TriStar Pictures, and so this is going to be a big motion picture. And I live in daily fear that, that somehow it won't do this justice. That's not any, that has, I mean, I love the filmmakers, I love the screenwriter, but it's just, of course it's so important. So I hope that I will have some, I'll get to see the screenplay, and I worked really hard to be still a part of it. But we'll see. So in 2 years when it comes out or whatever, you'll have to tell me what you think. I'm very worried. But thank you so much for your questions and for having me.